Shall I really name names here?
I think you should.
Please.
Okay, this is going to be a shocker. Hold on, folks. Burt Reynolds.
And are you and Bert still friends?
We don't really talk to each other, no.
At 78, Sally Field has finally revealed the 6 men she hated the most. She called Johnny Carson an octopus with wandering hands.
In a tell-all book in 2013 that you and Johnny dated. How would you characterize that relationship?
The octopus and the reluctant little guppy.
She told Johnny Carson she was having a mental breakdown to get away from him.
No,
I was never a person that knew how to say no to people.
Wow.
I mean, I when it came down to things, I
Right.
said, yeah. But I just, you know, ultimately, the only way I could get out of many things was to tell people I had lost my mind. I told them, I don't know, it was Johnny, I think it was, I told him I was having a breakdown and I was being sent away.
Here are the 6 men Sally Field hated the most. Burt Reynolds was the biggest movie star in the world when he called Sally Field in 1977. She had just wrapped a television movie and was dragging herself around in what she called an emotional dither. Sally didn't know Reynolds personally, but his phone call would change her life in the worst possible way. Reynolds was brutally honest about what he was offering. The script for Smokey and The Bandit was terrible, and he told her so before she even read it. He admitted there was basically no script at all, just an idea they could improvise through together. But Reynolds was the most popular actor in Hollywood, and Sally knew this could be her ticket back into movies after being stuck doing television work. Sally calculated the risk. She figured if the movie bombed, everyone would blame Reynolds instead of her. She could just be the unknown actress who got swept up in his disaster. It seemed smart at the time, but Sally had no idea what kind of man she was getting involved with. Reynolds had told her he always loved her in Gidget, and that was why he wanted her sitting next to him for an entire film. Sally thought this was flattering, not understanding that it revealed how Reynolds saw her. He wasn't interested in her as a serious actress. He was interested in her as a fantasy he could control and possess. The attraction between them started immediately, even before filming began. They had known each other maybe 3 or 4 days when something dangerous happened between them.
But God, I was so good. You should have seen me. You'd have loved me.
We'd known each other about 3 days, 4 days at that point. It was instantaneous, and 4 days felt like 4 years. So you can see it in our faces. Or, you know, we were sort of deeply entangled. And the nature of it wasn't just a, you know, oh, this is a love affair. Something, you know, so there was some ingredient between us having to do with my caretaking.
4 days felt like 4 years because of how quickly they became entangled. The chemistry was obvious to everyone, but this wasn't a healthy romance. There was something darker underneath. Sally immediately became Bert's caretaker, falling into a role she had learned since childhood. She was repeating destructive patterns without understanding what was happening. The relationship felt like destiny, but it was actually damage calling to damage. 2 broken people who fit together in all the wrong ways. Sally describes them as a perfect match of flaws, not hearts. Bert needed someone who would disappear for him completely, and Sally had spent her childhood learning how to make herself invisible. The toxic dynamic established itself immediately. Bert was a man of his generation who expected women to represent him in specific ways. He needed them to be extensions of himself rather than independent people. Sally couldn't be herself around him at all. She had to become whatever version he wanted to see at any given moment. Reynolds controlled everything about their relationship from the beginning. He decided where they went, what they did, who they saw, how they spent time. Sally had no voice in these decisions because she believed having preferences would make her unlovable. She watched herself disappear more each day, but couldn't figure out how to stop it. By the time they met, the weight of Reynolds' stardom had become his weapon for controlling everyone around him. From the moment Sally walked through the door, it became a way to control her. Sally describes falling blindly into a rut that had formed in her road, a pre-programmed behavior as if she had pledged herself to this man.
We were a perfect match of flaws.
Right.
We went together very well, but not necessarily for the right reasons.
Yeah.
We just, both of us felt, and again, it was a preformed rut in my road where I say in the book many times, if I could have been different.
They were a perfect match of flaws, which sounds romantic but was devastating. They went together well on the surface, but for all the wrong reasons that would destroy both of them. She describes their relationship as a pre-formed rut in her road, a pattern she had been set up to fall into since childhood. She wondered if things could have been different if she had stood up to him, but deep down, she knew the answer was no. Bert was who he was, a man who needed women to behave in specific ways to make him feel powerful. Sally couldn't be herself because she had never learned how to be herself. She was completely absent from her own relationship, behaving exactly as she had been taught since childhood. The relationship lasted several years, during which Sally gave up more of herself trying to make Bert happy. She dressed for him, walked for him, talked for him, existed entirely for him. Her career ambitions, dreams, sense of self became secondary to managing Bert's moods and needs. She became expert at reading his emotional state and adjusting accordingly. What happened to Sally was that she stopped existing entirely. She dressed for him, looked for him, walked for him. She wanted to be everything he ever wanted, and in trying to become that, she lost herself completely. The man who made her feel had also made her invisible, even to herself. The most devastating part was how it affected Sally's career during her most important moments. When she won her first Emmy Award for Sybil, she wasn't there to accept it. She was off shooting one of Bert's movies, primarily there to take care of him rather than celebrate her achievement. The studio begged her to come, offering to get her a dress and make arrangements. But Bert wasn't supportive.
I couldn't be myself. I was absent from, I was behaving the way I was taught, and that is to be loved, I had to disappear. Yeah. So I disappeared.
Sally was completely absent from her own life during those years with Bert. She was behaving exactly as she had been taught as a child. The fundamental lessons she learned growing up was that to be loved, she had to disappear completely. So she disappeared without question, becoming whatever Bert needed, while the real Sally Field ceased to exist. Instead of celebrating one of the biggest nights of her career, Sally watched the Emmy Awards alone in a rented condo with the sound turned down so she wouldn't wake anyone. She sat in the dark, watching other people accept awards while she hid in the shadows of her own life. Even years later, Sally blamed herself for this choice, but she understood she had been trained to put everyone else's needs first. When Sally finally ended the relationship, it was partly because of what she learned playing Norma Ray. The role taught her about standing up for herself and fighting for what was right. She began understanding she deserved better than disappearing for someone else's comfort. But by then, years of damage had been done. When Bert died in 2018, just days before Sally's memoir was published, she felt relief and sadness. She was relieved he would never read what she had written about their relationship. She knew the truth would hurt him, even though she tried to paint him as the colorful person he could sometimes be. But she had to tell the truth about what their relationship cost her. Years later, Bert would claim Sally was the love of his life, the one who got away. But Sally knew better. She understood Bert had never really loved her at all. He loved the idea of controlling someone completely. When she found strength to leave, she wasn't the one who got away. She was the one who escaped. Johnny Carson was the undisputed king of late-night television when he set his sights on Sally Field. She was emotionally vulnerable after her devastating breakup with Burt Reynolds and completely unprepared to handle Carson's relentless pursuit. Carson was used to getting exactly what he wanted, and what he wanted was Sally Field, whether she wanted him back or not. The relationship began when both were technically single. Carson had just separated from his third wife, Joanna Holland, while Sally was reeling from her 5-year relationship with Burt Reynolds. Someone close to the situation leaked to media that Carson and Sally were in love, but the reality was very different. This wasn't mutual romance between consenting adults. This was one powerful man pursuing a woman who didn't know how to make him stop. Carson was charming and funny in public, the beloved host who entertained millions of Americans every night. But behind the scenes, away from cameras and studio audiences, he was something else entirely. Sally describes him as an octopus, a man whose hands seemed to be everywhere at once, reaching and grabbing without permission. She felt like a reluctant little guppy caught in his tentacles, unable to escape without causing a scene or damaging her career. Carson was one of the most powerful men in entertainment. someone who could make or break careers with a single decision about who got booked on his show. Sally understood the dangerous position she was in. Rejecting Johnny Carson's advances could mean being blacklisted from the most important television show in America. But accepting them meant submitting to something she absolutely didn't want. Sally had never learned how to say no to people in positions of power. She had been taught that being accommodating was the key to survival and success. She had been conditioned to put other people's wants ahead of her own comfort and safety. When it came to Johnny Carson, these patterns left her completely helpless.
The octopus and the reluctant little guppy.
That's amazing. He was all hands with you. Was it one
I
date?
mean, he was like, so he's a wonderful, he's Johnny Carson, but I just was not, thinking, I was reluctant.
Right. Was it just one date then? No, it was
No,
more.
I was never a person that knew how to say no.
Carson had wandering hands that found their way to Sally constantly, regardless of whether she wanted his touch. She was reluctant from the beginning, but Carson either couldn't or wouldn't take no for an answer. This wasn't just one awkward date that could be forgotten. This was an ongoing situation. Sally didn't know how to escape without potentially destroying her career. The situation escalated quickly and became more uncomfortable with each encounter. Carson's pursuit became more aggressive and persistent, while Sally became more desperate to find a way out. She couldn't simply tell him she wasn't interested because she had never learned how to be direct about her own boundaries. She needed an excuse that would make him stop without making him angry. Carson would tell Sally how wonderful she was, how much he admired her, how perfect they would be together, but his words felt more like demands than compliments. Sally could sense the expectation underneath his charm, the assumption that she would naturally want to be with someone as powerful and famous as Johnny Carson. The fact that she didn't want him seemed incomprehensible to Carson.
I was never a person that knew how to say no to people.
Wow.
I mean, I when it came down to things, I
Right.
said, yeah. Right. But I just, ultimately, the only way I could get out of many things was to tell people I had lost my mind. I told them, I don't know, it was Johnny, I think it was, I told him I was having a breakdown and I was being sent away.
Sally's solution was to fake a complete mental breakdown. She told Carson she was having a nervous collapse and was being institutionalized for treatment. This was the only way she could think of to make him stop pursuing her without directly rejecting him. She couldn't figure out how to simply say she wasn't interested, so she had to create an elaborate lie about losing her sanity. This became Sally's go-to strategy for getting out of uncomfortable situations with powerful men. Pretending to have a mental breakdown was apparently the only escape route that felt safe to her. She couldn't risk directly saying no to someone who could damage her career, but she could present herself as too unstable to be worth pursuing. The fact that Sally felt she had to fake insanity rather than simply express her preferences shows how completely she had been conditioned to accommodate other people's desires at her own expense. She had been so thoroughly trained to be agreeable that the idea of having boundaries felt impossible and dangerous. Saying no to Johnny Carson felt more threatening than pretending to be mentally ill.
I couldn't figure out how just to say, I really am just not into this.
That's a good way to get the guy
I
to
just
stop.
said, I'm so sorry, I've got to go away. They're putting me in a hole.
That's amazing.
Sally told Carson she was being put away, that they were institutionalizing her for her own good. She made up this entire story about needing professional help because she couldn't bring herself to hurt his feelings by telling him the simple truth that she wasn't attracted to him. This level of people-pleasing was so extreme that it required her to sacrifice her own honesty to protect a man who was making her uncomfortable. Carson eventually backed off, but not because he respected Sally's boundaries or cared about her comfort. He stopped pursuing her only because he believed she was too crazy to be worth the effort. The message Sally received was that being seen as mentally unstable was more socially acceptable than being seen as a woman who had preferences and boundaries. The most heartbreaking part of this situation is that Sally genuinely couldn't figure out how to simply say she wasn't interested. She had been so thoroughly programmed to be accommodating that the basic human right to refuse unwanted attention felt impossible to exercise. Instead of being able to say, "No, thank you," she had to create an elaborate fiction about being institutionalized. The Johnny Carson experience became a turning point for Sally because it showed her just how destructive her people-pleasing patterns had become. She realized she would rather be seen as crazy than be seen as difficult or uncooperative. This was a wake-up call that eventually led her to start questioning the behaviors that had been controlling her life since childhood. Years later, when people asked Sally about her relationship with Johnny Carson, she would describe it as the octopus and the reluctant little guppy. This phrase captured everything about the power dynamic between them. Carson as the predator with reaching tentacles, Sally as the small, helpless creature trying to swim away. Jock Mahoney was 6 feet 4 inches of Hollywood muscle when he married Sally Field's mother Margaret in 1952. Sally was only 4 years old when this towering stuntman entered her life, but he would spend the next 14 years systematically destroying her sense of safety, boundaries, and self-worth. Mahoney was both a charmer and a predator, a man who could be magical one moment and cruel the next. Margaret Field had been briefly married to Sally's biological father before their divorce in 1950. She was a struggling actress trying to make it in Hollywood when she met Jock Mahoney, who seemed like a solution to all her problems. He was established in the film industry as a stuntman and B-movie actor, someone who could provide stability and security. But Margaret had no idea what kind of man she was bringing into her home. From the beginning, Mahoney established a dynamic of control and manipulation in the household. He was the kind of man who needed to dominate everyone around him, including small children who couldn't fight back. He worked systematically to make Sally and her brother Rick feel small and afraid, while also showering them with just enough gifts and attention to keep them confused about his true nature. Sally describes Mahoney as being able to be magical, like the Pied Piper leading their family as his entranced followers. He could be charming and fun when he wanted to be, taking the children on adventures and making them feel special. But these positive moments were always balanced by periods of cruelty that kept everyone walking on eggshells. The abuse began when Sally was around 7 years old, disguised as something innocent and helpful. Mahoney would claim his back was sore from his stuntman work, and he would ask Sally to walk on his back to help relieve the pain. Sally was so small that she could walk around on his large back like it was a dance floor.
He was a stuntman, so he was always sore and injured and wounded, and I was so little that it was almost like having a dance floor on this huge big back. And then that grew. Sal, come walk on my back. And so I did.
At first, Sally thought she was being helpful and special. Mahoney made her feel like she was the only one who could provide this particular kind of relief for his pain. He told her that her small size made her perfect for walking on his back, that she was uniquely suited for this important job. Sally felt proud and useful, not understanding that she was being groomed for something much worse. The back-walking sessions always took place in Mahoney's bedroom, with Sally's mother conveniently absent. Margaret would be downstairs making breakfast or busy with other tasks while Sally was called upstairs. This created a pattern of secrecy and private time between Sally and her stepfather that would become increasingly dangerous. Mahoney would lie face down on the bed, naked and tangled in sheets, while Sally walked carefully across his back. But the sessions never stayed confined to just his back. He would eventually roll over and guide her feet to other parts of his body, whispering instructions about where he wanted her to step. Sally knew something was wrong, but she didn't have the words to understand exactly what was happening. The most devastating aspect of the abuse was how it made Sally feel complicit and responsible. She felt both like a helpless child and like someone who had power over the situation. This confusion about her role created deep shame and self-doubt that would follow her for the rest of her life.
There isn't just one feeling.
One of the things that we always hear is how early shame sets in.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And how early the doubt of your complicity somehow sets in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how then do you grow up and have any sort of understanding of what healthy is?
Mahoney was careful to make Sally feel like she was a willing partner rather than a victim of abuse. He made her believe she had chosen to participate, that she enjoyed the attention and feeling of being special and needed. This manipulation ensured Sally wouldn't report what was happening or seek help from other adults. Sally describes feeling both powerful and powerless at the same time during these encounters. She felt powerful because Mahoney seemed to need something from her that only she could provide. But she also felt completely helpless and trapped, unable to say no or make the uncomfortable feelings go away. The abuse escalated over the years as Sally got older and Mahoney became bolder. What started as walking on his back expanded into other forms of inappropriate touching and contact. Sally learned to dissociate during these encounters, mentally removing herself from the situation while her body remained present. The secrecy surrounding the abuse was maintained through shame, fear, and manipulation. Mahoney made Sally believe what was happening between them was normal and natural, something all fathers and daughters did together in private. He also made her feel like she was special and chosen, someone who could provide comfort that no one else could give him. Sally's mother, Margaret, remained largely oblivious to what was happening, or at least she chose not to see the signs. This left Sally feeling completely alone and unprotected during the most vulnerable period of her life. She couldn't expect protection from her mother, so she had to find ways to protect herself with the limited resources available to a child. When Sally finally stopped the abuse at age 14, she did so through her own growing awareness and strength. She simply refused to continue participating, but by then the damage had been thoroughly established. The patterns that had been burned into her brain during those formative years would continue to affect her relationships for decades.
And for me to say to her, Mother, it wasn't just one moment in my life, an indiscretion on his part. It was my whole life. It was my whole childhood.
The abuse wasn't just isolated incidents Sally could compartmentalize and forget. It was a constant presence throughout her entire childhood, shaping every aspect of her development and her understanding of relationships, boundaries, and her own worth. The abuse affected how she saw herself, how she related to other people, and what she believed about love, power, and control. Decades later, when Sally finally confronted her aging mother about what had happened, Margaret admitted she had known something was wrong. She revealed that Jock had once confessed to her about doing something inappropriate with Sally, but Margaret had chosen to minimize the situation rather than protect her daughter. This revelation was almost as devastating as the original abuse. The confrontation happened in their kitchen, with Margaret trembling as she finally admitted what she had known and when. She told Sally that Jock had mentioned one event and had asked for forgiveness. But Sally made it clear there had been no single event. The abuse had been ongoing for years, defining her entire childhood experience. The next morning, Margaret tried to make amends in the only way she knew how. She grabbed Sally with a strength that seemed impossible for her frail body and promised Sally would never be alone in this again. But the promise came too late, after decades of damage had already been done. Mahoney died in 1989, long before Sally wrote her memoir and revealed the truth about their relationship. Sally had mixed feelings about his death, describing it as winning some kind of weird battle that had been going on between them for her entire life. She felt relief that he was gone, but also complicated sadness for the little girl she had been and the childhood that had been stolen from her. Jimmy Webb was already a successful songwriter when he met Sally Field in 1968. He had written hits like MacArthur Park and Wichita Lineman, and he was considered one of the most talented composers of his generation. Sally was just 22 years old, still trying to establish herself as a serious actress after being typecast by the Flying Nun. She was young, naive, and vulnerable when Webb entered her life. The late 1960s were a time of social revolution and changing attitudes about and relationships. For young people like Sally and Jimmy, this meant exploring boundaries that previous generations had considered taboo. But for Sally, who had already been damaged by years of childhood abuse, this newfound freedom was more dangerous than liberating. Jimmy Webb was part of the Hollywood music scene, a world where drugs flowed freely and inhibitions were considered outdated. He was charismatic and talented, the kind of man who could make women feel special just by paying attention to them. Sally was drawn to his creativity and success, seeing him as someone who could help her break out of the silly television roles that had defined her early career. Webb and Sally began spending time together, hanging out in the way that young people did in the late 60s. They would smoke marijuana together, listen to music, and talk about art and creativity. For Sally, this felt sophisticated and adult, a far cry from the wholesome image she had been forced to maintain as the Flying Nun.
It was came from a sort of traumatic kind of childhood, and I had put myself for survival in a sort of fog.
Sally's traumatic childhood had left her living in a kind of protective fog, disconnected from her own feelings and instincts. This made her particularly vulnerable to manipulation and exploitation because she couldn't trust her own reactions to dangerous situations. She had learned to ignore warning signs and accommodate other people's needs even when it put her at risk. One night in 1968, after doing together, Sally woke up to find Jimmy Webb on top of her, having with her without her consent. She describes him as grinding away to another melody, suggesting he was more focused on his own pleasure than on her consciousness or consent. Sally was confused and disoriented, not fully understanding what had happened or how to process the experience. In her memoir, Sally writes about this incident with a kind of detached confusion that reflects how she felt at the time. She didn't have the language or framework to understand that what had happened to her was assault. The concept of date wasn't widely discussed in 1968. Sally thought what had happened was somehow her fault. When Sally later told the New York Times about this incident, she said she didn't believe Webb had any malicious intent, describing him as just being stoned out of his mind. This generous interpretation reflects Sally's lifelong pattern of making excuses for men who hurt her, of finding ways to minimize their responsibility for harmful actions. Jimmy Webb's response to the allegation was equally telling. He told the Times he hadn't read Sally's description of the incident, but he characterized their time together as simply what 22-year-olds did in the late 60s. We hung out, we smoked pot, we had His casual dismissal of Sally's experience as normal behavior reveals the toxic attitudes that allowed assault to be dismissed during that era.
I would find myself in situations that were similar to my childhood, and I was blinded to them because I was used to it.
Yeah.
I was, you head towards, or you find yourself in situations that are repeating themselves because they are comfortable.
This experience reinforced all the worst lessons Sally had learned during her childhood abuse. It confirmed that her body didn't belong to her, that other people had the right to use her for their own purposes, and that she wasn't supposed to complain when she was hurt. It taught her that speaking up about mistreatment would be dismissed, so there was no point in trying to protect herself. The damage from this incident extended far beyond the immediate trauma. It affected Sally's ability to trust her own instincts and form healthy relationships. She learned to doubt her own perceptions of what was happening to her, to second-guess her reactions to uncomfortable situations, and to blame herself when men behaved badly toward her. Years later, when Sally finally had the courage to write about this experience in her memoir, she still couldn't bring herself to call it what it was. Even as a successful actress in her 70s, she still felt the need to protect Jimmy Webb from the full consequences of his actions. She still felt responsible for what had happened to her. The Jimmy Webb incident was just one example of how Sally's childhood abuse had set her up for a lifetime of exploitation and mistreatment. She had been trained to be accommodating and available, to put other people's needs ahead of her own safety, and to remain silent when she was hurt. These patterns would continue to affect her relationships for decades to come. Paul Newman was already a legendary movie star when Sally Field was cast opposite him in Absence of Malice in 1981. Unlike every other leading man she had worked with, Newman treated Sally with respect and professionalism from the very first day. He was everything that Bert Reynolds, Johnny Carson, and the other men in her life had failed to be. Sally was nervous about working with Newman because of his reputation and status in Hollywood. She knew she would be sharing scenes with one of the greatest actors of his generation, and she was worried about holding her own opposite such a formidable talent. But Newman put her at ease immediately with his genuine warmth and professional courtesy. In the film, Sally played a journalist who becomes involved with Newman's character, a man whose life has been destroyed by her newspaper's investigation. The role required Sally to convey both professional ambition and personal vulnerability, and Newman was supportive of her performance every step of the way.
Paul Newman makes his appearance in the movie.
Yeah.
He just walks
Yeah,
into
he
the
does.
newsroom quietly, and you look up and see the object of your story, and the audience is seeing, Paul Newman has arrived. And what do you do in the scene? You're so shaken you spill coffee all over your desk.
When Paul Newman walked into the newsroom set, Sally's reaction was completely genuine. She was so overwhelmed by his charisma and star presence that she actually shook and spilled coffee all over her desk. It was a perfect example of how Newman's natural magnetism could affect everyone around him, even experienced actors who should have been prepared for his arrival. But what made Newman different from other leading men wasn't just his talent or charisma, it was his character and his treatment of the people he worked with. He never made Sally feel small or insignificant. He never used his power to make her uncomfortable or to assert dominance over her. He was simply a consummate professional who treated everyone with respect. Sally had developed a very unusual way of handling her tension when working with major stars like Newman. She would become incredibly vulgar and funny, using crude humor as a defense mechanism to cope with her anxiety about working with such established talent.
I don't think I've ever told anybody this story. I had this very weird way of handling my tension at working with Paul. I wanted it out of the way. The way I combated it is that I was so vulgar.
Newman was delighted by Sally's vulgar humor rather than offended or put off by it. He would actually fall on the ground laughing at her crude jokes and stories. This reaction showed Sally that Newman was secure enough in himself that he didn't need to put other people down to feel powerful. He could appreciate and enjoy Sally's personality without feeling threatened by her humor or intelligence. This was a completely new experience for Sally. She had spent her entire career working with men who needed her to be smaller, quieter, and less herself in order to make them feel comfortable. Newman was the opposite. He encouraged Sally to be fully present and authentic, even when that authenticity came in the form of outrageous humor. Working with Newman taught Sally what it felt like to be treated as an equal by a leading man. He never made her feel like she had to earn her place on the set or prove that she deserved to be there. He simply accepted her as a talented actress who had every right to share scenes with him. The experience of working with Paul Newman became a reference point for Sally throughout the rest of her career. It showed her that not all powerful men in Hollywood were predators or bullies. Some of them were actually decent human beings who could use their influence to lift others up rather than tear them down. Newman's willingness to literally fall on the ground laughing at Sally's joke showed her what genuine respect and appreciation looked like. He wasn't pretending to find her funny to manipulate her or make her feel indebted to him. He genuinely enjoyed her company and her sense of humor, and he wasn't afraid to show it. Years later, when Sally looked back on her career and all the difficult men she had encountered, her time with Paul Newman stood out as a bright spot. He had shown her that it was possible for powerful men to be kind, respectful, and supportive of the women they worked with. His example gave her hope that not all men in positions of authority would use that authority to harm or exploit others. Paul Newman's treatment of Sally Field serves as a stark contrast to the behavior of the other 5 men on this list. While Bert Reynolds, Johnny Carson, Mahoney, Jimmy Webb, and the unnamed director all used their power to hurt and diminish Sally, Newman used his influence to make her feel valued and respected. He remains the one man from her past that Sally speaks of with genuine fondness and gratitude. Anyway, that's it for the video, folks. Bye.